Okay, so this is the first PowerPoint that you're going to be watching on your own outside of class for AP Biology. I'm going to give you a really short introduction because this is the first one you'll be doing. From this point forward, I'll dive right into the content to conserve the amount of time you have to spend watching these, but I want to make sure that you understand what's going on in these videos. So prior to class, I will assign videos for you to watch. I use a method called flipped classroom, which means instead of lecturing in class, you look at the material outside of class so we can spend all 90 minutes together doing labs, doing activities, making sure you really understand the content. So I'm just going to address what you should be doing while you watch these videos, why I'm having you watch these videos, and then we'll dive into the content. So the what should you be doing? You should be watching these for homework prior to the class that I assign them. You should be taking notes, and that is really up to you about how you do that. And the last thing that you should be doing is figuring out questions or content that you need me to cover. The goal of this is to watch these videos, figure out what you know, so when we get together as a class, I'm only addressing the stuff you don't understand. Just like figuring out a way for note-taking that makes the best sense for you, I would also determine what is the best way for you to keep track of your questions. Is it sticky notes? Is it highlighters? Is it inserting a column into your notes? Whatever it is, essentially your two goals for watching this video are taking your notes and addressing any questions or content that you want me to cover. The why are we doing these videos is I use something called a flipped classroom, which basically means instead of you sitting here for 30 minutes in class watching me talk about this, you do that part outside of class. So when we have 90 minutes together, we're doing a lab the whole time. We're working on activities. We're going deeper into the material. As you know, your AP test is the second week in May on a Monday. That date shows up very quickly, and if you're absent, if you do college visits, if you go on trips, the amount of time we spend together is very limited, and so this is the best way to go over the content. You will have limited other homework, but watching these videos, doing the readings that I assign, those of you who have already been in an AP class know that there's a lot of outside reading that has to be done. That's the why. Why are we watching these videos? So I'm going to dive into the content, and your goal is to take notes during this time. What you'll find is that I address a lot more content verbally than is on the slides. So it's your goal to start learning, and this is a great skill for college, what do I write down that Ms. Cook has said and what can I ignore? And that'll be a skill that we develop. Because what you'll find in college is that your professors will just lecture in front of you. They may not even have a PowerPoint, and it's your job to determine, am I going to write down every single thing that he says? And so what I would recommend is pausing the video, rewinding, doing what you need to do to best figure out what is important and what is not. Let's get started. This is the first PowerPoint for ecology, and let's dive right in. So you've seen these big ideas in the syllabus. Ecology draws from all four. Don't write these down. You have these in your syllabus. The study of ecology. So the study of ecology is looking at organisms and their interactions with the environment. That means abiotic, which are going to be the non-living factors, and biotic factors, which are the other living factors. There are multiple levels in our biosphere on our Earth. It's divided from the largest, which would be the biosphere, which is all living things, the ecosystem, which is like a large space of area. We talk about like biomes, right? So in the desert, we would have an ecosystem existing in that desert. Our community, our population, and then the individual, which we'll get to at the end of the unit. We talk about animal behavior, where we're going to actually be using fruit flies and looking at their behavior in the chambers, which is in the back of the classroom if you take a peek at our animal behavior chambers. So based on that division, we have all these different studies of ecology. If I told a scientist, oh, I'm just studying ecology, that's like such an overwhelming amount of information. And so we divide it into these four levels of of ecology, 4 studies or types of ecology, and we're going to go piece by piece. We're going to start a little bit bigger, and then the last thing we'll talk about is organismal ecology, which talks about animal behavior and all of that stuff. Some of these PowerPoints I've included quiz questions for yourself. Please feel free to pause and quiz yourself. I'm not going to do it right now. These have been inserted, both the question and then you'll see the answer in red, for your own benefit. So if you feel like that is necessary to use, please do that. So this is going to get a little physics heavy before we really dive into the biology of it. That's part of the AP test. So if you've taken physics, this hopefully should sound familiar. What we need to remember is that the Earth is a system, right? And we have these things called open and closed systems. A closed system means that the material stays within, cycles. An open system means things can enter and exit the system. And on our planet, an open system exists and a closed system exists. So the systems adhere to the first and the second law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics states that matter cannot be created or destroyed, that I have the same amount all the time. This, if you think about, we're made up of carbon. We are made up of the carbon that existed when our Earth first came into existence. If we look at this web, it's kind of looking at the fact that there's this exchange of material between our biotic or our living components and our non-living components. If we look, we'll see that the closed system deals mostly with matter. So water, gases, mineral, right? I'm made up of carbon, I'm made up of water. That's matter, and that never leaves our Earth's system. There's also an open system, and that's where energy exists. What that means is that energy can leave our system. It's usually in the form of heat, right? When I do an activity, I get hot, I sweat, I put off thermal energy. That will eventually leave my system and then leave the larger Earth system. Energy can also enter back into the system through thermal energy and light energy from the sun that then can be turned into free energy, which, if we remember, free energy is the usable energy that exists for us to do some sort of work, which for a human, for an organism, would be metabolic processes, cellular respiration, making energy. For plants, it would be photosynthesis and things like that. Again, when we look at the abiotic and the biotic interactions, what's important to remember is that for all of these interactions, there's our open system, and the best way to remember is that the open system deals with energy, and our closed system deals with matter, and that first law of thermodynamics, the idea that matter is not created or destroyed, is always in some sort of cycle. Here is a much better image of that. We'll see that the red is going to be your closed system. The blue, what color am I looking at? The yellow is going to be your open system, and we'll see that matter, right? Carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, minerals, those cycle in our closed system, whereas our heat leaves in that idea of an open system. It also enters, but mostly leaves. And before we leave that behind, you may want to look up the second law of thermodynamics as well. And this gets a little bit complicated. I'll actually backtrack for a minute. The second law of thermodynamics, if you remember this from physics, deals with the idea of entropy, right? That there is disorder in our system, or a large amount of thermal energy. And there's this constant balance between free energy and disorder or thermal energy. Free energy being usable chemical energy, and disorder or unusable energy being heat. And we'll see that because of this open and closed system, right, within the red, we have a lot of free energy, which is, carbon bonds, which is usable energy for me. I eat that food, those carbon bonds, that's a free, usable energy for me to do something. Once I put it off as heat, that's not usable for anyone else. That increases the disorder in my system, and then in the larger Earth system. And so we see that there's this balance between free energy and entropy or disorder or thermal energy. When we starting to talk about the organisms, the abiotic factors are what determine where organisms can live, because the abiotic factors will shape the biome, which is, desert, grassland, temperate forest, savanna, all the things you remember from Gen Bio. The abiotic factors, right? The temperature, the amount of water that's present, all of those things, the soil, not the living things in the soil, but the other parts, right? Like a clay soil versus like a dirt-based soil. Those determine where something can live. Availability of light, all of them listed on these slides. So that dictates where an organism can live, and then the biotic factors determine its success. So if we look at this graph, and you'll want to pause this, what you'll find is that the AP Biology exam is very similar to the ACT Science test, which is not a lot of science content, although there is science content, so don't ignore that. There is a lot of graphs that you're going to need to interpret, and so being able to pause this and say, okay, I understand what's going on here, and please remind me in lecture, we should go over this. That is an important skill, right? If we look at the different colored lines, these are all 4 separate tests, right? We're looking at seaweed cover versus the presence of these different species. What we look is that if we have limpets and the sea urchin removed, seaweed goes booming. That makes sense. There's nothing preying on the seaweed. If we look at the blue, only urchins are removed. We see that the limpets have a really hard time controlling the seaweed cover. They do a better job than everything gone, but we see that the seaweed still increases pretty rapidly. We see that the green is going to be only limpets removed, so we see that the sea urchins aggressively will eat the seaweed, and then if we look control, both of them are present. We see that they both feed upon the seaweed. What we recognize then is that not only do the limpets and the urchins eat the seaweed, there's also dynamics going on between the sea urchin and the limpet, and it can kind of control what happens. So the other thing that can impact the environment that an organism lives in is going to be its latitude and also its season. We know that as we look at the latitude, right, the lines that go across the globe, if you are on the same latitude as another area, you're going to experience similar seasonal changes. That is because it dictates how close I am to the sun. We know that the Earth is tilted on an axis and it rotates. And so if I'm on the same line or the same latitude line, I'm going to experience the same tilt and the same exposure to the sun. This is why all places along the equator, regardless of where they are longitudinally, that is going to dictate that I'll have very similar seasons. It's why we are comparable to Europe on our latitude line. That means that we will also experience very similar seasons. And if you've ever traveled to Europe or you want to travel to Europe, you'll find that it's very similar. If you go north of us to Canada and all the way up Alaska, you'll see that Russia, Alaska, like the Eurasia parts of the other continents, they experience similar weather. Therefore, their organisms look kind of similar. That's going to be your macroclimate. Your microclimate is going to be defined by very small patterns just where you live. So my microclimate would be my house. A ant microclimate would be under its log. These also talk about climate a little bit more, and how they determine what organisms will live in a certain area. These are pretty self-explanatory. Feel free to pause here and jot these down. Our time allotment for each video is only 15 minutes, so I'm going to have to pause here, and you'll have to click on the Ecology PowerPoint Part 2. That's going to be right next to this video.